Hi, it's Natasha N.K.O on Thursday, 16th of July, 11:49 a.m. I'm going to finish chapter 3 of M. Scott Peck, People of the Lie. This section is called The Case of the Spider Phobia. It reads, "To this day, I cannot understand how it was that Billie remained in therapy. The fact that she did remain is an enormous tribute to both the genius of her therapist and the genius of Billie herself. It was a sort of miracle. Billie was taken to a colleague of mine by her mother because of academic underachievement. 16 at the time and very bright, she was doing poorly in school. After 6 months of therapy, Billie's grades had improved slightly. She had also clearly developed a certain attachment to her therapist, a mature and kindly man of infinite patience. At this point, her mother stated that the problem was solved. Billie wanted to continue in therapy. Her mother refused to pay for it. Her therapist reduced the already minimum fee to $5 a session. Billie, whose allowance was $5 a week and who had $200 saved, began paying him out of her own money. Soon her mother stopped her allowance. Billie got her first job during her senior year of high school in order to continue to pay for her therapy. That was 7 years ago. Billie is still in therapy, but the end is beginning to be in sight. One of the reasons it is so remarkable that Billie stayed in therapy, paying for it out of her allowance and then out of her meagre salary, is that for the first 3 years, Billie did not feel that there was anything the matter with her. On some unconscious level, she must have known that something was radically wrong, but consciously, she was utterly cool about her problems. She vaguely wished she could get better grades, yet she was perfectly ready to acknowledge she almost never did her homework. This she blandly attributed to laziness, and after all, aren't many high school kids lazy? The only thing that could possibly be identified as a symptom was her fear of spiders. Billie hated spiders. Any spider. Whenever she saw a spider, she literally ran away in panic. If she noticed a spider in the house, no matter how minuscule or harmless appearing, she wouldn't stay in the house unless someone killed and removed it. But this phobia was ego-symptotic. While she recognized that almost everybody was much less afraid of spiders than she, Billie concluded that this was because others were insensitive. If they appreciated how really horrible spiders were, then they would be just as afraid as she was. Since she consciously felt nothing was wrong with her, it is hardly surprising that Billie broke at least as many appointments as she kept. But somehow her therapist hung in there over the first 3 years, and somehow Billie did also. During these years, Billie passionately hated her father and adored her mother. A lifelong bank clerk, her father was a shy and taciturn man who seemed to Billie as cold and distant as her mother was warm and close. Billie, the only child, and her mother were companions. They confided in each other their closest secrets. Her mother always had at least several lovers, and throughout her adolescence, Billie liked nothing better than to listen to her mother's tales of the ins and outs and ups and downs of her extramarital affairs. There seemed to be nothing wrong in this. Billie's mother blamed her affairs on her husband's isolated, unaffectionate personality. They seemed a natural response to his lack of interest, and Billie and her mother were united in their hatred of him. Against him, they felt almost like gleeful co-conspirators. Her mother was as eager to listen to all the sexual and romantic details of Billie's life as Billie was to listen to hers. Billie considered herself very fortunate to have such a loving and interested mother. She was not able to explain why her mother refused to pay for her therapy, but she was hardly able or willing to criticize her mother in this regard. Whenever the issue was raised by her therapist, Billie sidestepped it vigorously. When Billie told her mother about her own boyfriends, there was a lot to tell. Billie was frankly promiscuous. Her mother never criticized this. After all, she had many lovers too. It was not, however, that Billie wanted to be promiscuous. On the contrary, she yearned painfully for a deep and lasting relationship with a man. But it never seemed to work out. She would fall head over heels in love with a man, almost immediately move into his apartment, but within a few days or a few weeks, the relationship invariably soured and Billie was back at home with her parents. Beautiful, intelligent and charming, Billie never had difficulty finding new lovers. Within a week, she would be in love again. But as always, within a few more weeks, the relationship would be dead. Billie faintly began to wonder if somehow she killed those relationships. It was this bit of wonder and her pain at being unable to hold on to her lovers that caused Billie to begin working more seriously in therapy. Very gradually, the basis of the pattern emerged. Billie couldn't tolerate being alone. Having fallen in love with a man, she would want to go with him wherever he went. She would always sleep with him, whether or not she felt sexual, because that would guarantee that he would stay with her, at least for the night. When they awoke in the morning, she would plead with him not to go to work. He would have to tear himself away from her. Inevitably, the man would feel suffocated. He would start to break dates. She would redouble her efforts to cling to him. He would feel more suffocated. Finally, on some excuse, he would terminate the relationship. Billie then picked up the first man she could find, even though his intelligence and character were often less than desirable. Unable to tolerate being alone, she was unable to wait long enough for a more deserving lover to appear on the scene. She would fall in love with whoever was closest at hand, cling to him immediately, and the vicious cycle would repeat itself. Once her fear of being alone was uncovered, it also became clear why Billie had been an underachiever in school. To read a book or write a paper requires solitude. Billie had been unable to do her homework because she had been unwilling to tear herself away from people, particularly from her mother, who was always ready for a chat, long enough to carry out an assignment. Although it was now identified as a problem, Billie felt helpless to do anything about it. She recognized that her terror of aloneness limited her in certain ways, but what could be done? It was a part of her nature. Self-destructive though the pattern might be, it was just the way she was. She could not even imagine being any other way. So nothing changed except that her phobia of spiders became worse. She would no longer walk with her boyfriends through the woods or even down a shaded street at night, lest she inadvertently brush against a spider. At this point, her therapist took a bold step. He insisted that Billie, who hitherto had always lived either with her lovers or her parents, get an apartment of her own. She refused. It was a ridiculous expense. Oh, of course it had advantages. She could bring lovers home with her. She could play her stereo whenever she wanted. She could feel more independent. But how could she possibly afford it? Now that she was working steadily, the therapist had raised her fee from $5 a session to his standard rate of $25. That was more than $100 a month she was paying him, a quarter of her salary. He offered to reduce his fee again to $5 an hour. Billie was touched, but still couldn't afford it, she claimed. Besides, what would happen if she found a spider in her apartment one night and she was all alone? What would she do then? No, an apartment of her own was out of the question. My colleague pointed out to her that she was doing absolutely nothing to deal with her fear of being alone. Unless she took some step to actually choose aloneness, he said he saw no hope for her therapy. There must be some other step, she argued. He asked her to think of one. She could not, but insisted he was being too demanding and would just have to drop the idea. He told her he would refuse to see her any more unless she got an apartment. She raved at his cruelty. He remained adamant. So, finally, in the 4th year of her therapy, Billie rented her own apartment. Three things immediately happened. One was that Billie became more aware of just what a compelling force her fear of aloneness was. On nights when she was not with a lover, she became extremely anxious in her empty apartment. By 9 in the evening, she could no longer tolerate it and would drive back to her mother's house to chat and then sleep there. On weekends, when she had nothing to do, she spent the entire time with her parents. During the first 6 months of renting her apartment, she slept there alone on no more than half a dozen occasions. She was paying for an apartment that she was too frightened to use. It was absurd. She became annoyed with herself. She began to think that maybe, just maybe, this fear of aloneness was really sick. The second thing that happened was that a change seemed to come over her father. When she reluctantly announced she was going to get her own apartment, he suggested that perhaps she would like to have some furniture he had inherited, which was sitting unused in a barn. Then on her moving day, he borrowed a truck from one of his friends and helped her load and unload the furniture. He gave her a bottle of champagne for her housewarming. Once she was settled in, he began a pattern of making her a present of some small object for the apartment every month or so. A new lamp, a print to hang on the wall, a bath mat, a fruit bowl, a set of kitchen knives. These gifts were given unostentatiously, wrapped in plain brown paper and quietly dropped off for her at her place of work. But Billie realised they were chosen with care. They were all in good taste. She had not thought of her father before as having good taste, and she knew he had little extra money to spare for such things. Although he remained shy and withdrawn and difficult to talk to, for the first time she could remember, Billie was quite touched by his interest in her. She wondered if the interest, subtle though it was, might not have been there all along. In relation to the apartment, Billie's mother was as unhelpful as her father was generous. Several times she asked her mother for little odds and ends that had been tucked away in corners of the family house, but suddenly her mother seemed to have developed a use for them. Her mother never asked her about the new apartment. In fact, Billie began to notice that whenever she mentioned the apartment, her mother seemed to be annoyed, even cutting. "Don't you think you're being just a bit self-centered, talking about your apartment this and your apartment that all the time?" she said on one occasion. Slowly, it dawned on Billie that her mother did not want her to move out of the family home. This was a third thing that happened. It was a thing that snowballed. At first, Billie rather enjoyed the fact that her mother was upset about her moving out. Didn't that show how much her mother loved her? And wasn't it nice to always be welcomed back at the family home, to have her mother to chat with late into the night, to have her old bedroom always ready for her, not to have to return to her lonely apartment with the possibility of spiders in the dark? But the magic began to go out of this, bit by bit. For one thing, she and her mother no longer had Billie's father to talk against. When her mother railed against him as usual, Billie began to say, "Come on, Mum, he's not really that bad. Sometimes I think he's even kind of sweet." This sort of response seemed to inflame her mother. Immediately, her mother's remarks about her father would become positively vicious, or else she would turn around and start attacking Billie for not being sympathetic. These moments became distinctly unpleasant. Finally, Billie had to ask her mother not to talk against her father when they were together, since it invariably ended in a quarrel. Her mother grudgingly complied, but without their mutual enemy, Billie and her mother had much less to talk about. Then there was the matter of Wednesday evenings. Billie was an office manager for a small publishing company. Every Thursday morning, it made a single large weekly shipment to other parts of the country. The nature of Billie's responsibilities required her to be in the office by 6 o'clock on those mornings. Whenever she spent the night at her parents' house, it somehow seemed impossible, chatting away with her mother, to get to bed before midnight. The result was that on Thursday mornings, Billie invariably felt wretched from lack of sleep. With the help of her therapist, she made a vow that on Wednesday night, on just that one night, if on no other night of the week, she would sleep alone in her apartment and would be back there no later than 9 o'clock in the evening. For the first 10 weeks, Billie was unable to keep her vow. She was never able to be back in her apartment before midnight. Each week, her therapist would ask her how well she had fulfilled her vow, and each week, Billie had to confess failure. First, she was furious at her therapist. Then, she was furious with herself for not being able to stick to her resolution. She began to look seriously at her weakness. For several sessions, she talked of her ambivalence about the vow, her fear of the loneliness of her apartment, her desire to remain in the warmth of the family home. At this point, her mother might be able to help her keep her vow. No, at this point, her therapist asked Billie if she thought there was any way her mother might be able to help her keep her vow. Billie was delighted with the idea. She immediately told her mother about the vow and requested her encouragement to leave the house by 8:30 on Wednesday evenings. Her mother refused. "What you and that therapist of yours do is your business, not mine," she said. Billie felt there was a certain amount of truth in this, but she also began to suspect that her mother might have reasons of her own for not wanting Billie to keep the vow. The suspicion grew, and as it grew, Billie began to observe her mother's behaviour on Wednesday nights. She'd noticed that invariably around 8:30, her mother would bring up some particularly provocative topic for discussion. Once she recognised this pattern, Billie tried to interrupt it. At 8:45, in the middle of one such topic, Billie stood up and announced that she had to leave. "Don't you think you're being rude?" her mother asked. She reminded her mother of her vow and suggested that even if it wasn't her mother's responsibility to help her keep it, perhaps it was her responsibility at least to respect it. They got into a heated argument. Her mother cried. It was after midnight when Billie got back to her apartment. Thereafter, Billie observed that if her mother's genius for bringing up a provocative topic at 8:30 failed to have an effect, she would then demonstrate an equal genius for starting an argument. By the 14th week of her still unkept vow, this pattern too had become clear to Billie. That Wednesday night at 8:30, her mother started a story. Billie stood up, saying she was sorry she didn't have time to hear it. Her mother began to argue. Billie announced she didn't have time to argue either. She moved to the door. Her mother literally clutched at her sleeve. Billie tore herself away. She was in her apartment at the stroke of 9. 5 minutes later, the phone rang. It was her mother. Billie had left in such a hurry, she said. She hadn't had time to tell her that the doctor thought maybe she had gallstones. Billie's fear of spiders became even worse. At this point, Billie still adored her mother. In therapy, she had become able to criticize her mother quite freely and accurately, yet she was never actually angry, and she continued to take every possible opportunity to be in her mother's company. It was as if she had developed two brains, a new one that could look at her mother objectively, coexisting with the old one that remained utterly unchanged. Her therapist pressed forward. It was not just on Wednesday evenings, he suggested, that her mother clung to her. Perhaps her mother didn't want Billie to leave her or develop a separate existence in any dimension. He reminded her once again that her mother had refused to pay for her therapy as soon as it had become important in Billie's life. Could it be that her mother was jealous of Billie's attachment to therapy because it was an attachment to something other than herself? And why had she so resented Billie's getting her own apartment? Might she not resent Billie's developing independence and separation? Maybe so, Billie countered, but her mother had never objected to her having boyfriends and lovers. Didn't this indicate that her mother had no desire to hold on to her? Perhaps her therapist acknowledged, but then it might also indicate simply that her mother wanted Billie to be a carbon copy of herself. Perhaps her mother used Billie's promiscuity to justify her own. Besides, the more alike the two of them were, the less the chance they would ever separate. And so the struggle went on, week after week, month after month. Endlessly, back and forth over the same issues with no sign of resolution in sight. But a subtly enormous change did occur in the 6th year of her therapy. Billie began to write poetry. At first, she showed her poems to her mother. Her mother was not particularly interested, but Billie was proud of her poetry. It was a new, surprising dimension of herself. It was uniquely her, something her own. She bought an elegant leather-bound volume in which to record her poems. The urge to write did not come often, but when it did, it was compelling. For the first time in her life, when she was working on a poem, Billie found herself enjoying being alone. Indeed, she had to be alone. She couldn't concentrate in her parents' house with her mother's constant interruptions, so when the urge hit her, she would suddenly stand up and announce that she had to return to her apartment. "But it's not Wednesday night," her mother would shriek, and Billie would have to tear herself away from her mother once again. It was after one such episode, when she was describing to her therapist how her mother had clutched at her as she was leaving to write, that Billie commented, "She was like a goddamn spider." "I've been waiting a long time for you to say that," her therapist exclaimed. "Say what?" "That your mother's like a spider." "So? But you hate and fear spiders?" "I don't hate my mother," Billie said, "and I don't fear her either." "Maybe you should." "But I don't want to." "So you hate and fear spiders instead?" Billie missed her next appointment. When she returned, her therapist suggested she had skipped the appointment because she was angry at him for making a connection between her mother and her spider phobia. Billie missed the next 2 appointments. But when she finally came back, she was ready to face it. "All right," she said, "so I've got a phobia. What is a phobia anyway? How does it work?" "Phobias are the result of displacement," her therapist explained. "They occur when a normal fear or revulsion towards something is displaced onto something else. People employ this defensive displacement because they do not want to acknowledge the original fear or revulsion. In Billie's case, she didn't want to acknowledge her mother's evil. Naturally, what child would want to think of her mother as malicious or destructive? Like any child, Billie wanted to believe that her mother loved her, that her mother was safe and kind and good. But to believe this, she somehow had to get rid of the fear and revulsion she instinctively felt toward her mother's evil. She did this by directing the fear and revulsion toward the spiders. Spiders were the evil ones, not her mother. "But my mother is not evil," Billie proclaimed. It was true that her mother was not keen on her becoming independent, and that she used all manner of wiles and tricks to try to keep Billie from developing a fully separate existence. But this was not a matter of evil. It was just because her mother was lonely. And she, Billie, understood about loneliness. It was terrible to feel lonely. It was also human. Humans are social creatures. They need each other. The fact that her mother clung to her from loneliness was hardly evil. It was only human. "While loneliness is human," her therapist responded, "the inability to tolerate it is hardly a necessary part of the human condition." He went on to explain that it was the task of parents to assist their children to achieve their own independence and separateness. In order to succeed in this task, it was essential for parents to tolerate their own loneliness so as to allow and even encourage their children to eventually leave them. Instead, to discourage such separation not only represented a failure in the parental task, but a sacrificing of the child's growth to the parent's own immature, self-centered desires. It was destructive. Yes, he thought it was evil, and Billie was right to be afraid of it. Slowly, Billie came to see it, and the more she saw, the more her eyes were opened. She began to notice hundreds of infinitely subtle little ways in which her mother continually attempted to retain her spirit in her clutches. In her leather-bound book, Billie wrote one evening, "Ambiguity and guilt can really drive one crazy. You send me my clean laundry, which you did. In it, you include the first turned leaf of fall. Manipulation, guilt, your method really works." Yet little changed. Billie, now 23, still spent most nights sleeping in her parents' house and most of her free time with her mother. Although falling behind on her payments for therapy, she would pay a substantial portion of her week's salary to take her mother out to lunch at the most expensive restaurant in the area. And the pattern of her relationships with men continued unaltered. The falling in love, the clinging, the suffocating, the breaking up, the frantic searching, the falling in love again, man after man, time after time. And she was just as terrified of spiders as ever. The hard part was yet to come. Nothing's happening, Billie complained in therapy one day. That's the way it feels to me too, her therapist responded. Well, why not, Billie demanded. It's been 7 years I've been seeing you now. What the hell more do I have to do? Figure out why you still have your spider phobia. I've recognised that my mother is a spider, Billie replied. Then why do you keep dropping into her lair and web? You know, like her, I'm lonely. Her therapist looked at Billie. He hoped she was ready. So maybe, in part, you too are a spider, he said. Billie sobbed for the remainder of the session. But the next session she was there, right on time, even eager for the painful work ahead. It was true. She felt like a spider sometimes. When men started to leave her, she clutched at them, just as her mother clutched at her. She hated them for going. She didn't care about their feelings. She didn't care about them. She wanted them for herself. Yes, it was like something evil in her, an evil urge, an evil part of her taking over. The spider phobia had not only helped her to deny her mother's evil, she had used it to deny the evil in herself. It was all so connected and intertwined. She had identified with her mother. They were so much the same. How could she genuinely fight against her mother's evil unless at the same time she fought against herself? How could she condemn her mother for holding on to her without condemning herself for refusing to tolerate her own loneliness? How could she stop trying to trap men in her own web? Men who ought to stand free and tall and strong, just as she ought to stand free and tall and strong. The problem was not how to extricate herself from her mother's web anymore, since her mother's identity was so much hers. The problem was to extricate herself from herself. And how in God's name do you do that? But Billie is doing it. In the name of God or her true self, she is somehow beginning to separate from her mother, to definitively break free from their symbiotic relationship. In her leather-bound book, she recently wrote, "Amazing to me how your disease pops up in me all the time, part of my very being, without me even knowing, so hard to fight an enemy one can't see. So scary to think you're in me, so incorporated into my thinking and feeling that it is indistinguishable from me. It is me. I feel like a mulatto who is part of the Ku Klux Klan, hating the very essence of part of me, working on eradicating part of myself. This is probably the hardest thing that I ever will do. Sometimes it feels so unnatural. I often wonder how it is that I became different from you, to have the will to want to be different from you." It looks as if Billie is beginning to break the chain. That's the end of chapter 3 altogether. That was an enjoyable read because it reminded me of lots of stuff, but stuff that I've worked on already. So I might give a ramblings a babysit because I think useful things comes up that other people can use. So thanks for listening.